Exodus chapter 19. We're starting a new series this morning where we are going to be studying through the Ten Commandments. We've titled it The Ten. It's short for the Ten Commandments. In Exodus chapter 20, it's what we call the law. And there's lots of responses. When we talk about the law, there are lots of ways that people respond to that. Particularly, here we are, we're coming to the fall, and this is what we're going to talk about, the law. Probably, I'm assuming, for most of us, that doesn't really strike a chord of excitement. Right? At least for me, when I hear law, when I've heard law in my life, I hear something that is impossible. I hear something that crushes me, something that's discouraging, something that tells me that I don't measure up, something that tells me that I'm not good enough. Not something that I really want to spend a lot of time talking about. And the other part of it is for a lot of people within the church today, hey, Tom, could you close that door? It just kind of popped open there. I don't want to disturb them. For a lot of people in the church, for Christians, at least this has been kind of the attitude that I've often had is, why talk about the law? Isn't it all about just loving people? Right, we're all about love. Didn't God, Jesus came, he did away with the law, and now it's just about let's love people. And the problem with that attitude, the problem with both of those is that they're oversimplified understanding of the law. It's what we have done within the church, and I've done it myself as a pastor, as a Christian, is in an effort to make things clear and understandable, is that we have simplified things. But what we've done is we've oversimplified things. And I'll give you two examples. I'll give you a few examples. The first one, when I said that so often when I think of the law, I think of something that crushes me, something that tells me I don't measure up, something that is impossible. That is true. Romans chapter 3 says that God gave us the law not as a stairway to heaven, not as a way to get to him, but as a wall. In fact, I'll read it to you because I think it's better for you to hear it from this than just from my summary of it. Romans chapter 3, you don't have to turn there with me, I'll read it for you. But Romans chapter 3, verses 19 and 20 says, "Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin." He says, listen, here's what the law was given so that it would actually shut your mouth. Why? Because when we use the law to make ourselves right with God, here's what happens. I have to speak. I have to justify myself. I have to argue my case. I have to say, well, sure, I did some bad things, but look at all the good things that I've done. I've got to somehow argue my case to prove that I'm good enough. And God says, no, see, the law isn't there so that you can argue your case. The law is there to tell you don't have a case. You don't have a case. Yet at the same time, let me read another place to you in Scripture. So yes, it's true. The law tells you you can't do it. It's not there for you to earn your salvation. It's not there to bring you to God. But yet in another place in Scripture, Psalm chapter 19, David is writing, and listen to this. The law of the Lord is perfect, listen, reviving the soul. What? The law reviving? The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter than honey. So on the one hand, we have Paul saying, hey, listen, the law crushes you. It tells you you can't do it. You don't have a case. And then on the other side, you've got David saying the law is so wonderful. It's so beautiful. And you say, which one is it? And the answer is it's both. It's not an either or. It's a both and. But in our effort to oversimplify, we've emphasized one and left the other one out. Because for many of us, we hear David and we go, well, we haven't heard that piece of it. When we hear the law, we hear all the bad things. We don't hear that it's beautiful. I mean, do you understand when David says that the law, it revives the soul? Do you understand how that is even possible? I would say for most of us, the answer is no. And I would tell you for me, for the longest time, the answer would have been no. So I'm speaking from experience. Another example. In our effort to simplify things, in our effort to try to make things clear and understandable, and then thus oversimplify them, we have, I'll use another one, grace versus obedience. You see, we have a fear, and it's not a bad fear. The fear is that people would begin to think that salvation is not by grace alone, but it's by grace plus you doing a lot of good things. Yes, Jesus died for you, but you've got to kind of earn that and deserve it by being good enough. And so in an effort to keep us from buying that, and in an effort to keep us from hearing that, what we emphasize is grace, and we don't talk about obedience hardly at all. And let me just give you an example, and many of you you'll relate to this, and this has been my history, so I relate to this, obviously. Ephesians 2. You know Ephesians 2, 8, and 9? You know those verses? How about verse 10? See, lots of us who have grown up in the church, we know Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, but here's what we've done. We've left off verse 10. And here's Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Listen to it. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast, period. Right? So salvation, how do we get saved? Grace alone through faith alone. Not by works, so that no one can boast. But then listen to verse 10. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. It is amazing to me that in my church experience, I heard 8 and 9, and no one ever really talked about 10. He says, yes, we're saved by grace alone through faith alone, but there's a purpose behind it. There's a calling. God is saving you for a purpose. He's saving you not just from something, he's saving you to something. And let's rewind and let's go back to that question when people say, well, isn't it all about love? I mean, why would we spend all this, the 10 Commandments, talking about the law? That's Old Testament. That's old school. That's back then. But now Jesus has come and he's shown us a whole new way, and it's all about love. And let me ask you to just stop for a moment and think about that. Is it really a whole new way? Is love really the antithesis of the law? When we talk about love, are we really talking about something that is... See, the issue is in our culture is we want love without responsibility. We want love without rules. We want love without vows, commitment. But the problem is that that's not how love really works. Anyone who's married knows that. Anyone who's ever fallen in love knows that. When you fall in love with someone, there are rules and requirements, not that are manipulated, but are naturally a part of a relationship. You don't have a relationship without responsibility. And when Jesus says, do you remember someone asks Jesus to summarize, what is the law? Do you remember when Jesus summarizes law? How does he summarize it? Does he say, hey, let's not talk about law, let's talk about love? No, when Jesus summarizes the law, he says there's two things that summarize everything in the law. All that God has given in the law are summarized in two things. And what are they? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. In other words, what Christ says is the law is not the antithesis, love is not the antithesis of the law, love is the fulfillment of it. In other words, yeah, let's talk about love. And guess what? When we talk about the law, we actually are talking about love. We're talking about the way that love actually is worked out, that when you truly love someone, as we're going to see this morning, that it doesn't just come out in whatever way that you want, but rather there's a specific way that love comes out when we truly love. Jesus says, here's what we do. We fulfill the law. If you're going to understand that, and if we're going to understand our study through the 10 Commandments, then really what Exodus 19 is it's a window. It's a window through which we need to see everything else. And I'm going to walk you through it this morning. And it's deep and it's rich. And to be honest with you, just one verse contains the whole rest of the Old Testament up to this point. One verse summarizes everything in the Old Testament from Genesis chapter 1 all the way up to Exodus chapter 19, just one verse. And so this one chapter provides a whole history as well as a window looking forward into the law that God's about to give in Exodus chapter 20, and actually gives us a picture to understand our own relationship with God through Christ. All right, so take a look. We're starting in verse 1. It says, on the third moon after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession. Among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. Verse 8, all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. This is God's word. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word to us this morning. I thank you that it is far more deep and complex than we even understand. That every time we come, even to a passage that is familiar to us, that we've been around for a long time, even when we come to those passages, we come and we see new things each time. It keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's because it's your word. It's about you. It's not our word about you. It's not man's word about you. It's your word to us. Your personal revelation to teach us the truth of who you are and all you've done, who we are, and God, the hope that we have in you and what you've called us to. And today, I pray this morning that we would get a deeper and fuller understanding of all of that. A deeper understanding of who you are, a deeper understanding of what you've done, a deeper understanding of ourselves and the hope that you've given to us, the salvation that you've given to us, and the life that you've called us to. I thank you that you speak to us. I thank you that it's not all on me this morning, that it's not up to my words, though, Lord, you use me at the end of the day. Lord, it's by your Spirit that you speak to us, and so, God, give us ears to hear. As you do speak to us, Lord, give us a mind to understand and grasp. So much depth and richness here. And Lord, help us to not just hear and to understand and have good information. Lord, I pray that you would drive it deep within our hearts, that it would grow us, that it would shape us not just individually but as a community together. I pray it for your glory in Jesus' name. Amen. There's 4 things I want to show you from this passage. Number 1, I want to show you grace. Number 2, I want to show you obedience, the call. God's grace, God's call to obedience. Number 3, the purpose of that. What's the purpose? Why is God about to give the people of Israel the 10 Commandments? What's the purpose of that? And then number 4, let's talk about application. And here's the wonderful thing. We're looking at the Old Testament. We're looking at things that happened thousands of years ago. And what's so amazing about this, and it reminds me that this is God's word, is that all of this is directly applicable to your life. It's directly applicable to everyone's life in this room, that you can walk out of here, whether you're in elementary school, whether you're in high school, whether you're in college, whether you don't have kids, whether you have kids, whether you're married, whether you're single, whether you're younger, whether you're more experienced, whatever it is, it applies to every single person in this room. So what's the application of it? That's what we'll look at last. But first of all, let's start with grace. Think about this for a moment. When you think of the Old Testament, what are the words that come to your mind? What are the words that come to your mind when you think of the Old Testament? That's not rhetorical. Go ahead and answer me. What? Old? Yep. Good. What else? Mystery. History. I'll say mystery as well then. History. What else? Exodus. Rules. Being tested. Sacrifice. Blood. Israel. Kings. Moses. You can't say Jesus. Well, you could, but probably it's not the first word that comes to your mind. How about judgment? How about wrath? What's the first word? What are the first words that come to your mind when you think about New Testament? Jesus. What else? Miracles. Grace. Forgiveness. love. I mean, just stop for a moment and think about this. My grandfather, wonderful man, loved him. He one day came to me. He knew I was going to go into ministry, and he came to me and said, Dan, I want to make one thing clear to you. He said, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are very different. The God of the Old Testament is the God of wrath, judgment, anger. But the God of the New Testament is the God of love and grace and forgiveness and mercy, and that's the God that we serve. Just here in this room, realize what we just said a moment ago. The one word that never came out when we talked about the Old Testament, grace. Another word that never came out when we talked about the New Testament, judgment, wrath. I mean, we talk about law. We don't think of law when we think of the New Testament. We think of law when we think of the Old Testament. We don't think of grace when we think of the Old Testament. We think of grace when we think of the New Testament because we have a preset understanding. And it's not necessarily your fault. It's been taught to you this way. It's been brought to you this way. It's the way that I learned it. You know, the Old Testament is about law and works, and the New Testament is about grace and faith and forgiveness. But yet, here's what I want to show you this morning is that that's not true. That for as much grace is in the New Testament, just as much as is in the Old Testament. You may not believe me, but I'll show you. And just as much judgment in the Old Testament, there's just as much in the New Testament. There is one God, and He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He does not change. I want you to understand this. God's plan has never changed. Do you understand? Do you know that? And some of us don't know that, and that's okay. We're going to work through that. If you don't, if you're saying, well, really? Because it really seems to me like He had a plan in the Old Testament, didn't really work out, so He came up with a new plan to send Jesus because we couldn't do it. No, He's had one plan all along. In fact, we're told in the New Testament that before the foundations of the earth were laid, He had this plan, which was in Jesus Christ. This has been His plan all along. And the way to salvation all along, it has never been works. It's always been grace. Do you see it in the passage that we just read? Where does God start? In chapter 19. So where does this story really begin? Does God come to Israel and Egypt and say, hey, listen up. Now, you guys are slaves here. And I know that you want to get out. It's pretty rough. But here's the deal. If you do this, 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 and this, I'll get you out of here. And then they do it, and He brings them out. Is that the way it happens? No, it isn't. In case you didn't, if you missed it, look at verse 4. Here's where God starts. He doesn't start with law. He doesn't start with rules. He doesn't start with commandments. He doesn't start with conditions. Israel, up to this point in time, has done nothing in terms of obeying laws, commandments, and rules and conditions. Listen to what God says. He says, verse 4, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Do you see the language here? This language that God is using with the Israelites is the language of grace. He says, I bore you on eagle's wings. I carried you out. I brought you to myself. It wasn't, hey, you came to me. It wasn't, hey, I gave you the rules, you followed, and I brought you out. He didn't come to Israel with rules, commands, and law. He came to them through Moses and invited them out. And do you remember how they were saved from the Egyptians? Do you remember how God ultimately brought them out? God sends the plagues. The last plague is the death of the firstborn son. God says, I'm going to pass through the land. I'm going to bring end times judgment in a specific location, in a specific moment in history. I'm passing through the land. And every firstborn in every home is going to die, whether Egyptian or Israelite. Why? Because in that time, the firstborn son was representative of the entire family. He's saying, I'm going to bring my judgment, and the firstborn of every family. Now think about that for a moment. Who's your firstborn? And how many of us are firstborns? The firstborn, God says, as a representative of every family, is going to die, whether Hebrew or Egyptian. He says, but there's a way out. And what's the way out? Well, I'm going to have you've got to do this rule, you've got to do this law, you've got to follow this. If you do enough of these things, then maybe when I pass through, if you've done enough of them, I'll pass over and I'll let it go. No. God says, here's what you need to do. You need to take a lamb, 1 year old, and you're going to sacrifice it. You put the blood of that lamb on the door, and when I see the blood, I'm going to pass over, and you'll be saved. Is it because of works? You could say, well, sure, they had to do work. They had to sacrifice the lamb and put it on the door. We could get really picky here. But at the end of the day, they were saved by the grace of God. It was nothing that they were doing. It was the blood of a lamb on a door. Yeah, they had to believe God and do it, but that's it. That's all they had to do. They had to believe him. And in believing him, they put the blood on the doorpost. God passes through the land, and they're rescued and saved. Pharaoh sends them out, and then he changes his mind. They come up to the borders of the Red Sea, and they're all losing their minds. They're really getting upset. And they're angry with Moses, they're angry with God, and they say, you just brought us out here to die. So they wouldn't have to dig graves back in Egypt. Isn't that what you did? And what does Moses say? He says, hey, listen, you know what? We just really didn't keep God's law, so now we're really going to get the judgment. No, here's what Moses says. He says, I want you to stand still. Stand still and watch the salvation that the Lord will work today. Stand still. You don't get any, it doesn't get any more clear than that. There's nothing that you need to do but trust. Stand still because God's going to work a salvation for us. And what does God do? He parts the Red Sea. They walk through. He closes it over Pharaoh's army. And here they are. They come to Mount Sinai. They've gathered around the mountain. And God comes and he says, what? Remember, it's all of grace. I've done this all for you. I did this for you. And get this, it's not just I brought you to me here at the mountain. He's saying, I brought you to myself. I brought you out into a relationship with me. And by the way, as I said, this actually, in this one verse, is contained the entire history, not just from Exodus chapter 1 to this point, but going all the way back into Genesis. You see, for us, we hear this through a lens of the New Testament, through kind of it's like we're listening through the New Testament. That makes sense because that's where we are. But I want you to stop and try to imagine that you are actually an Israelite, a Hebrew at this moment. When God says all of these things, when God says, if you look at verse 5, he says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, what are you hearing at this moment? And the answer is, you're hearing all the way back into Genesis. You're hearing the whole story of grace up to this point. And here's the story of grace. I'm going to tell it to you very briefly. It is rich, it is deep, it is a lot more than what I've time to tell you this morning. But you've got to hear this. So stay with me. It's in your notes. If you miss anything, if you really want to come back, you can always listen to it again online. I don't know if you want to do that. I don't like listening in my own voice. Anyways, Genesis chapter 12, God chooses a man named Abram. Take a look. It's there, the first big paragraph on your notes. It says, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. Listen, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God comes to Abram and makes a big promise here. Then he comes again in chapter 15. And Abram's getting nervous, by the way, at the beginning of chapter 15 because he's older, and he has no children. He and his wife are beyond kind of the childbearing stage. It's really not natural at this point. Yet God has promised that he's going to have a descendant, and Abraham's getting really upset here because he's going, God, I don't have a child yet. And God says to him, look toward the heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And look at verse 6, and he believed the Lord, and he, God, counted it to him as righteousness. Now, what's the law? What are the rules up to this point in time? Sure, God called him to leave his land. Yes, I get that. But up to this point in time, in terms of this promise to make him a great nation, in order to bless him, to make his descendants as many as the stars in the sky, what law has God given? What rules, what conditions has he made? What has God said, hey, listen, you have to do this, 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 and this. And if you do this, 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 and this, then we'll be okay, and I will make your name great, and I'll make you'll have all these descendants. He doesn't come to Abraham when he says, hey, I don't have any children yet, and say to him, well, because you didn't keep all the rules. He just simply comes and reaffirms his promise to him. And notice, what does Abram do? He believes. And it says, and it was counted to him as righteousness. It was counted to him as being made right with God. By what? By grace through faith, not by works, so that no man can boast. This is all grace. It's all been grace. With Israel coming from Egypt to Mount Sinai, all grace. No rules, no conditions, no, hey, if you do this and this, I'll save you. It's I saved you. I brought you out. I carried you. I brought you to myself. All on grace. Abraham, I chose you, not because you earned it, not because you deserved it, but because I chose you and it's my right. It's because of my sovereign goodness. I chose you. I've promised this on the basis of grace. And by the way, Abraham believes, he counts it as righteousness, and yet Abraham says, really, he asks for a sign. God is so patient. God doesn't say, Abram, will you just be, you're not allowed to say another thing. Don't question me again. I'm God. God says to Abram, and I want you to, as best as I can, to paint this amazing picture, because it's absolutely astounding. God says to Abram, I want you to go and get some animals. And God doesn't give Abram any instructions of what he's to do with the animals. Abram just goes and he does it. And this isn't really fun for animal lovers, but here's what Abram does. Abram takes the animals and he cuts them in half and he lays them out on the ground, which sounds really disgusting. And you're going, what in the world are you doing? And the answer is, Abram knows that when God says to go get animals, Abram knows that God is about to enter into a covenant with him. A covenant. Now, a covenant is different from a contract. Contract is a business agreement. A covenant is a relational agreement. Covenant is about business, or a contract is about business. A covenant is about relationship. The best picture of a covenant that we have today, because it is a covenant, the best picture we have is marriage. Marriage is a covenant relationship, and here's what a covenant relationship looks like. It is where you make promises to each other. I'm going to be responsible for this. You're going to be responsible to this, and I'm committing to it. And in the Old Testament, and we don't do this today, thank goodness, it'd be a little bit, imagine if we had to cut animals in half and walk between them when we got married. When they would cut animals in half, what would happen is the people who are entering into a covenant together would walk between them and they would state their promise. And what it was symbolic of is they were saying, if I break my covenant, let me be like these animals. Let me be torn to pieces. If I break my promise to you, let me be torn to pieces. Now, oftentimes, both parties would walk through. There are also times when if it was like a great king and a lesser vassal, a lower person on the rungs of society, the king wouldn't walk through, the lower person would walk through. As a sign that if they broke their covenant with the king, they would be destroyed. That's what they deserved. And yet I want you to see what happens here. There is nothing else in the world like this. Nothing. And by the way, remember where we're at. We're in the Old Testament. Genesis. It's where it all begins. And listen to what happens. It's the next paragraph after what we just read. He says this, God says this, as he's making his covenant, he says, know for certain, see if this sounds familiar to you at all, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, slaves there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out and with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. Do you see why when I said in that one verse is contained the whole Old Testament to this point? When they heard God saying, look, I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. I'm the one who carried you out. It comes all the way back to Genesis chapter 17 or Genesis 15 where God is saying to Abram, listen, here's what's going to happen. They're going to be slaves in a land that's not their own, but I'm going to bring them out. This is God's fulfillment of his promise. But look at how it continues. Verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt, of the great river to the great river, the river Euphrates. Here's why that moves me so much, is because who passes through? There's this firepot and a flaming torch that passes through these animals that have been cut in half. Who is it that passes through? You've got God and Abram. Who should be passing through? Abram should be passing through. And who is it that passes through? God passes through it. It's as if God is saying, in essence, the promise of the fulfillment of this covenant is ultimately all on me. It is all grace. It is all my promise, and I'm the one to fulfill it. If I don't fulfill it, may I be like these animals, torn to pieces. Is there grace in the Old Testament? There's grace from the very beginning. Grace to Abram, I've promised this to you. I'm the one who's going to fulfill it. Grace to Israel, I'm the one who carried you out. I'm the one who brought you out of the land. It's all promise. It's all promise. It's all grace. It's all the basis of God's gracious sovereignty that he would do any of this. It's not been based on anything that the people have done up to this point in time. Nothing. God says it's all on me, but he doesn't stop there. See, when we share the gospel, so often, boom, we stop right there. See, grace, faith alone, by grace alone, through faith alone. True. But God doesn't stop at that point. He continues to verse 10 of Ephesians chapter 2. And he makes a call for obedience. And he does it with Abram. Go forward from chapter 15. So God said, it's all on me, but here's the deal. You have a part to play. It's not on you. I'm the one who's going to fulfill the promise. I'm the one who's going to fulfill the covenant. But understand, covenant is not a contract. It's a relationship. And so God says, the fulfillment is on me, but you still have a part to play. And what's the part? Look in your notes, bottom of your notes there on page 1. When Abram, this is chapter 17, verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. And it continues on. And he calls him to obedience to the covenant. And he gives him the sign of circumcision. People don't like to talk about circumcision. It makes us all a little bit uncomfortable. But I want you to understand what God is doing here at this moment. He's saying to Abram, I've made the promise. It's all on me. Now here's what I'm calling you to. I'm calling you to be mine. I'm not just calling you for your sake. I'm not just calling you for you so you can have the promise and be blessed. I'm calling you so that we can be in relationship together. And if we're going to be in relationship, here's the deal. This is the way that you're going to be called to live. And what circumcision is, it is a sign at the most intimate place on a man's body. It is a symbol to say, I belong to God. It was a sign of the covenant. It was a sign of God's promise that's all on him. And my part, which is to say, here's what it is. God, I'm yours. I'm not you. It's not saying, God, I'm yours so that I will get the promise. It's saying, God, I'm yours because I already have the promise. God does the same thing with Israel. Look at verse, you're still there in Exodus 19. Look at verse 4 and 5. I'll read it again. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice. He doesn't say, if you obey, I'll save you. He's saying, I saved you and I've brought you to myself. Now, out of that, obey. And here's what's amazing about this. It is the opposite of every man-made religion in this world. Man-made religion says this, if you obey, you will be saved. God says, I've saved you, now obey. Radically different. Sounds very simple, amazingly different. One is I do in order to be. One is I am, therefore I do. God says, I've saved you, now here's your part. It's about a relationship. And the obvious question that everyone asks this is, well, but if it's all grace, then why should I obey? Right? I mean, what's the point? Because for us, on our part, we understand obedience from a man's viewpoint as being the way we get saved. But if we're already saved, then what's the point of obeying? And here's what I'll say to you, and I don't mean this harshly, I just mean it honestly. When we ask that, and I've asked it myself, it's because we do not understand what salvation really is. We don't really understand it. We don't really understand the purpose of salvation and the goal of the gospel. We've oversimplified it. You see, God actually answers the question, and I want to show you the answer. And it's right here in chapter 19. And let me just give you the three answers, and I'll take a look with me. He says it. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. Now, keep my covenant is pointing back to Abraham. Obey my voice is pointing forward to the 10 commandments, the commandments he's about to give. He's saying, keep the covenant and obey my voice. In other words, you're to be surrendered to me. I'm to be your king. You're to be my people. If you do this, listen, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. There's 3 reasons that God gives the law in the context of grace. He doesn't give the law in order for people to earn salvation. He gives it because they've already been saved. And there's 3 reasons, and they apply directly to us today as well. 3 reasons right here. Number 1, he gives it because, take a look at your notes on the second page. He gives the law for relationship. He says, if you obey, you'll be my treasured possession. This is an amazing word that he uses here. Treasured possession means the private treasure of a great king. Now, a king owns everything. At that time, king owned everything, even the people. And what God says, by the way, look at that verse. Verse 5, he says, I own, everything belongs to me, but I want you to be my treasured people. Everything belongs to me, and yet here's my goal. This is why I saved you. He didn't just save Israel, the Hebrew people, out of Egypt just so they could be free from slavery. He saved them so that they could be in an intimate, treasured relationship with him. I mean, think about this. You know, everybody here recognizes that I married up. Right? I mean, I tell Sarah, I'm serious. You can clap. That's okay. It's true. I tell Sarah, I mean, there's times where I'll say to her, I can't believe that you married me. I don't know what you were thinking. But, you know, it is actually, and I truly mean this, it's astounding to me that she loves me the way that she does. And when you feel that way, when you say, man, this person, I love this person, and can you believe that she loves me? What do you naturally want to do? You want to show them how amazing that really is. You want to show them how much you love them and how much you appreciate them. It's not a job. You don't go, oh, great, now I got to show them that I love them. What do I got to do? When you love someone and you see how amazing it is that they love you. You know, Gary Chapman, he wrote the book, The 5 Love Languages. And that whole book is about learning how to speak love to your spouse in the way that they best hear it and experience it and understand it. And I think that's a wonderful truth. Because there are ways that we experience love that are different from each other. And when I love someone, I want to speak love to them. So that I want to speak love to Sarah. And I don't do an amazing job of this. I really do try. One of her love languages is back massages. And I just... Anyways, I do try. I really do. But I want her to know I love her. Therefore, I want to speak the way that she best experiences love. See, I married up, but when we were brought into a relationship with God, there's no more up than you can get. The God of the universe says, I want you to be my treasured people. And when we really get that he's loved us and grace has been poured out into us and he's brought us to himself, don't you want to speak God's love language? Do you want to know what the law is? God says, here's what pleases me. Here's what brings me joy. I want you to be my treasured people. My love language, I want you to hear this. My love language is obedience out of love. When Jesus says, if you love me, what's the very next thing he says? You'll sing some songs to me? No. And there's nothing wrong with singing songs. I love to sing. He says, you'll obey my commandments. If you love me, the expression of that love in a relationship with God, God says, I saved you, not so you could just be saved, but so we could have a relationship so that you could be my treasured people. And as my treasured people, if we're going to have a treasured relationship, God has been speaking our love language from the very beginning. If we want to speak God's love language, here's what it is. He says, here's what it is. Obey my voice. I'm to be your king. You're to be my people. Number 2, he gave it to us so that we might be truly free. He says, I've saved you to be a holy nation. Holy means set apart. Nation, it's a culture. It's a people group. He says, I saved you to be truly free, living according to my law. See, we misdefine freedom in our world today. We define freedom, and I've said this before, I'm going to say it briefly today. We define freedom as the ability to do whatever I want, whenever I want. That's how we define freedom. Here's the problem with that definition. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, and end up more enslaved, more oppressed than I ever was before. So that cannot be the definition of freedom. What is the definition of freedom? Here's the true definition of freedom. The true definition of freedom is the culture that provides you the ability to be fully and completely who you were created to be. Freedom is the atmosphere that provides you the context to be fully and completely who you were created to be. And do you know who you were created to be? You were created to be God's. We were created to be God's people. We were created to live with God as our King. When God gives us His law, do you understand He doesn't just choose arbitrary rules for the sake of choosing them? Let's pull this one out, let's pull this one out, let's get that one. This one sounds really hard, let's put that one on the list. When God gives us His law, here's what He's saying. He's saying, this is the way life was created to be lived. Would not a good God tell us how to live? Would not a good God say, hey, listen, if you live this way, you're really who you were created to be, which means you're free. If you live this way, here's where you'll find joy. If you live the opposite this way, that's where you'll find suffering and pain and unhappiness and despair. And we've all experienced it. When God says, I saved you to be a holy nation, He's saying, I saved you to be a counterculture in the world. We live in an upside-down world where good is bad and bad is good and right is wrong and wrong is right. And God says, I have saved you to be an right-side-up nation in an upside-down world who truly live free in a world where nobody else lives free. It doesn't matter what country they live in. If you're not a part of my kingdom, God says, you're not free, but I saved you to be in my kingdom under my rule and reign. Freedom is not the absence of rules, it's the presence of the right rules. Freedom is not the absence of authority, it's the presence of the right authority. And that's why God saved you, to set you free. But freedom isn't with you as king, it's with Him as king. He says, I'm giving this so that you can be free, so that you can be a holy nation. And last, He gives us a law because He saved us to be on mission. He says, you will be to me a kingdom of priests. What does a priest do? I'll say three things. Number one, a priest teaches the truth about God. Number two, a priest serves as kind of the go-between, someone who brings people to God. And number three, someone who shows people who God actually is. I teach the truth about God, I show people who God is, and I invite them to come in. And God doesn't say, hey, listen, you're going to be a kingdom with priests. I saved you to be a kingdom of priests. In other words, I saved you to be people who are on mission, who are showing people who I am, who are teaching people the truth of who I am, and who are inviting them in. And that's why I gave you the law. I didn't give you the law as a way to me. Yes, it shows you how imperfect you are, but we have to move beyond just understanding it that way. In fact, there's a quote in your notes, and I'm just going to read it to you. It's from Tim Keller. And my notes are very blurry, so I can't really read the full thing. Sarah, can I have your notes for a second? My printer at home. So he says this: God's salvation is not individually bringing people to heaven, but it's creating a counterculture, an alternative society, an alternate city in every city of people who operate their relationships on fundamentally different principles. That's what the law is about. If you read through chapters 20 through 24 and you think of it not as a way to get an individual saved and get to heaven, but as an outline for a fundamentally different, radically different human community, then you're going to see it's a thing of beauty. Sex, money, and power in God's city, as we'll see as we study through this, are used in non-destructive, non-addictive, non-exploitative ways, completely different than the way they're used in the human cities of this world. You want to understand the law. If you don't see it through this window, you'll never get it. You'll only see it in part, not in whole. And so as we're going through this is what we're going to be seeing. This is what we're going to be studying. This is what we're about. This is about, by the way, us. Because take a look. Look into your notes later down, number 2. Under number 2, I'm quoting from 1 Peter chapter 2. It says, but you are a chosen race. See if this sounds familiar. Talking to the church, us. a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you've received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Do you see that what God has done with Israel in Exodus chapter 19 on, he's done the same thing with us. It all applies. It starts with grace. Right? Look at same letter, 1 Peter. Look at under number 1. It says, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might what? What does it say? Bring us to God. When God talks to Israel in Exodus 19, what does he say? I carried you out. I brought you to me. It's all grace. Christ came and he suffered once for all. He dies, the righteous, the sinless one, for the sinners. So that what? So that just by the blood, as the blood of the Lamb was on the doorposts of the homes of the Israelites in Egypt, so the blood of Christ might cover our lives, that we by grace alone, through faith alone, might be put into a right relationship with God. And how? The same way as Abram. He believed and it was counted to him as righteousness. But to the one who stops working, Paul writes in Romans 4, but believes in him, to him it's counted as righteousness. That's the message of the gospel. It starts with that, but it doesn't stop with that. So the first invitation is the invitation of grace. Believe. And listen, understand, when you don't believe, you're like the Israelite in Egypt who doesn't put the blood on the doorpost of his home. God says, I provided the way for you, but you've got to actually believe. You've got to accept it. You've got to receive. But he doesn't stop there, because God says, I didn't just save you so that you would go to heaven. I didn't just save you so that you wouldn't be in slavery to sin in terms of the punishment. I saved you from the power of sin, and I saved you not just for one day, I saved you for today. And the same three things that he says for Israel, he says for us. I saved you to be my treasured possession. Do you see it in those verses I just read? Look at it again. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his what? Own possession. God saved us to be his treasured possession. Are you living as his treasured possession? As those who've been saved by grace, have you made it your goal to please him? Have you made it your goal to speak the love language of God? Number 2, he saved us to be what? He says a holy nation. When people look at you, do they see someone who is just like them? Sure, I believe, but really I'm no different than anyone else. No, that's not possible. That's not true. If we're God's people, we're radically different. Because everybody else is living up according to the upside-down rules of the upside-down world. We are living according to the right side up rules, because we live under the rule and authority of the true King. Have we made it our goal? When people look at us as a church, do they see that? And last, are you living as a royal priest of the King? He says we're to be royal priests. People who show God, teach the truth of God, and who are inviting other people in to be the treasured possession of God. And by the way, you want to know how we do that? Jesus says it in Matthew chapter 5. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. You know, most people hear that, and what they hear is, I am the light by myself. I am a light of the world. And yes, together we can be a city on a hill. But I am the light. No, that's not what Jesus is actually saying. He's saying together, as a community of my people, as a holy nation, as a kingdom of priests, you together are a light in the world. A city on a hill. We want people to see the truth of the gospel. And by the way, he saved us to be his treasured possession. He's saved us to be truly free, but understand, he saved us to be on mission. If there's anything else that we can talk about as a church, as we're entering into the fall, I'm so glad we're doing this. Because this is what it's all about. We are the kingdom, a holy nation of God, living in the kingdom of Christ, called to be royal priests as the treasured people, the treasured possession of God. That's what this is all about. That's what the gospel is all about. That's what salvation is all about. And that's the invitation.